Hello and welcome to Lightways Astrology with me, Anna Isabel. And today I have Deva Green, who is going to talk to us about her book, Evolutionary Astrology, Pluto and Your Cosmic Mission. Deva, welcome to Lightways.
Thanks so much for taking the time.
I've been really enjoying your book, and I thought it might be nice to just perhaps explain a little bit about what evolutionary astrology is.
Oh, that's such a great discussion point. And right, that evolutionary astrology is founded in or rooted in natural laws, which essentially are principles or laws that are that you can experience for yourself. Through self-validation. One of the quotes I remember as I was learning is that evolutionary astrology astrology can't create life, it can only reflect life, which from my understanding really goes back to natural laws, and that what's taught in evolutionary astrology can be validated by us all.
I think it's an interesting point to talk about it as natural law, because what we're talking about then is the evolution of the soul being part of natural law.
That's exactly right, that it's based on progressive incarnations, that the soul purges or releases separating desires as it returns to source. The evolution of the soul through progressive lifetimes based on natural laws. And we can all experience this truth for ourselves when we experience the desire to go beyond or to evolve past where we currently are, and yet we hit the insecurity of the nature of the moment to secure the past. And it's right in that heart, it's right in that meeting point between past and future that we can tune into the natural laws that are taught in evolutionary astrology to help us break through that fear, to help us break through the security mechanism that's linked with the past.
So, to take you back a little bit, you talked about separating desire. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that?
Great question. Yeah, from my understanding, that within the soul there are two co-equal yet two antithetical desires, one to return to source and one to separate, and that separating desires essentially are desires to remain separate or to maintain the past. And whenever we have a feeling, or whenever we are propelled to again move beyond or to deepen ourselves in a general sense, and yet we resist, or yet we desire to maintain what's secure and what's familiar, the desire to stay separate, that we can see the nature of our separating desires to maintain the past in a separate existence.
So I think maybe a tangible experience that we might all be able to relate to just within one lifetime is the fact that we have to separate from the womb in order to grow as individuals. But there's always that call back to childhood and to home and to mother, because even where that's not been a good experience, somehow there's something about the familiarity or the desire to have that connection with mother, even where it's not been possible to have it. It's always there. So it's like a tension, I think, that you're describing there, of needing to grow, needing to go beyond, but at the same time feeling the pull for security.
That's exactly right. It's to maintain security, what's known and familiar. And I love your tangible example of wanting to being called back to our root, or feeling that going back to or reconnecting with our origins or with our creator or our source. And yet that brings up that fear of separation, or that brings up that fear of being able to essentially welcome in or embrace the unknown, to break up those static security patterns that we've brought in from our past. And yeah, it's been my experience, and many others, I'm sure, that we're always feeling that call to go back to the mother, or go back to our root. And that's what essentially can guide us to the desire to return, or the desire to remerge or to unite back with the source that created us.
And just thinking further about the natural law side of things, we have plenty of examples in nature of the homing instinct. You know, salmon going back to where they were born in order to lay eggs, and birds going back to where they come from in order to nest, etc. So there's something here when you're talking about natural law, about that instinct homing, that homing instinct, except that this time when we're talking about the soul, it's homing. The homing instinct is taking us back to the source of all creation, what some people might call God.
Oh, exactly. It's like the soul is hardwired or programmed for exactly that process. And to share with you, I know for myself that I've never quite felt at home until I started the process of removing external sources of dependency. And ultimately, it's that process, I think in the East, is called nete nete, the natural law of nete nete, not this, not that. It's not this that I'm looking for, not that I'm looking for, that homing instinct that you're bringing up, or that you're talking about. And it's only when I acted on that, as I'm sure we've all experienced, that sense of inner home, or that sense of returning to the source of all things was emotionally felt or integrated.
Indeed. And now we can start thinking beyond that return home and think about the process of growth and change on the journey to home. So this isn't about one lifetime. So it's about two journeys to home. It's the journey that happens within incarnation, but it's also the journey that happens outside of incarnation. Because after each incarnation, although we go back to source, there's yet more to develop and do to get deeper into the source, which is why we come back for another incarnation and then another incarnation. Does that sound like what you're thinking?
Right, that progressively we purge or we exhaust all desires except the desire to unite or to merge with source. And that typically takes a great amount of evolutionary time. But it's exactly as you were saying, that it brings us deeper and deeper into the process, or we progressively purge or exhaust those separating desires that can seem very tempting, or that can seem very much like they'll hold meaning and satisfaction, but they end up either it's that sense of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. We can have a desire for just about anything, for a new relationship, a new career, and so on. And for a time, it can provide a sense of satisfaction, and yet what soon replaces that is the feeling of dissatisfaction. And that's actually an echo of the desire to return to source. Many, of course, won't consciously understand it that way, but in the end, it's that emotional integration point that only the reunification, or only the the remerging with source can bring us that sense of satisfaction or meaning, going deeper and deeper, and why we come back and come back and come back again.
So, time to talk about the astrological angle to this. So, when we're looking at astrology from an evolutionary soul perspective, then we're looking at specific areas of the chart for clues as to how we're progressing on this journey. So your book is talking about Pluto specifically. So it might be nice if you can tell us a little bit about Pluto's role in all of this.
Yeah, that from my understanding, Pluto, from evolutionary astrology perspective, symbolizes the soul and the dual desires within the soul, and where the soul will naturally pick up in this lifetime relative to past life desires or past life orientation and desires of the soul. So where you see Pluto by natal house and sign position in the birth chart, there's a natural pickup point, or there will be a natural point of gravitation that the soul will come into in this lifetime. And from that symbol as well, you can see the heart of the emotional security pattern. That this it represents the deepest sense of unconscious emotional security that many of us can have. So when you look at natal Pluto, you can see the point where the soul will be holding a deep sense of strength, or holding a personal sense of identification, and also where it will be returning to for emotional security purposes. So looking at that in terms of progression, if you look at the opposite house and sign, that's how the soul will be evolving out of, or that's how the soul will be balancing out the energies of natal Pluto, in order for those energies to metamorphose, or to generate, or to be expressed at a higher level of expression without the limitations of the past. So what I have found by using my own birth chart, and also with friends and clients, is that by looking at Pluto, you'll be able to discern where they'll naturally be gravitated to in the current life, where they can hold an amazing amount of potential strength, and also the points of limitation, the points that will draw them back into the past due to emotional security.
So if we were to say, well, let's start at the beginning. If we were looking at, say, Pluto in the first house, that's very clearly going to be perhaps very self-reliant. And if we're looking then at the opposite point, that would be the seventh house. So then the journey is to move from self-reliance towards learning to perhaps trust others and in relation to others.
Right, that with Pluto in the first, that they'll be coming in with a tremendous amount of self-independence, being able to ask and answer their own questions from within themselves, to strike out on their own, and so on. And the limitation would then be to initiate relationships with others in which the desire to discover a new aspect of themselves, which is the core of Pluto in the first, self-discovery, self-identity, to discover a new aspect of themselves through that freedom, that by including others essentially as equal as well, that relationships will be perceived as contributing to that self-discovery, rather than limiting, or a fear of merging with others because of a fear of restriction, or a fear of not being able to have freedom to explore or discover what they need, or for the freedom to do what they would feel instinctually drawn to do. So that's right, the journey would be to complete that within relationships, to embrace relationships in co-equality, to where they can also initiate mutual independence, where both both people can have the freedom or mutual independence to discover and explore themselves in the context of a relationship.
There is something else in the book that you talk about, which I was very drawn to, which is the idea that change can happen in different ways. It can happen in the most challenging and painful ways. I think you called that cataclysmic, or in at a slower pace. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that evolution can occur essentially in two different ways, as you were saying. One is cataclysmic, which is total change in a short amount of time. And the other is static or uniform evolution, which the net gain is change, but it occurs over a great length of evolutionary time. So when you have cataclysmic evolution, it's typically that the soul desires to affect change in a short deal of time, and that there may have either been a resistance to change based on evolutionary necessity. So a soul can program a cataclysmic event because of its own resistance to the necessary changes and the desire to move forward. So then a cataclysmic event which can come overnight, whether it's a sudden or traumatic loss, something that happens really in a short amount of time that drastically changes the soul's life and enforces the change. And that can help the soul work through its own resistance because it's given no other choice, it's enforced. And when you see the slow but progressive change, and typically the non-stressful aspects will indicate the slow but the uniform change, slow but progressive. Over time, it creates the same effect. And that's when the soul is typically working with those changes every single day. That there's an awareness of what needs to change, and the soul is able to then put into motion or consciously integrate those changes slowly over time. And the cataclysmic evolution is typically symbolized by stressful aspects. There are no hard and fast rules, but so when you look at the birth chart and you see stressful aspects to Pluto, in a general sense, a general rule of thumb is that there may be cataclysmic events that help us, that in the long run put the necessary amount of pressure for the soul to change. And the non-stressful aspects, or the slow but progressive change, that if the soul doesn't act upon that knowledge, that can become cataclysmic, or if that knowledge is resisted or not acted upon, the non-stressful aspects can become stressful through transit or progression. So it's like looking out in nature, and cataclysmic evolution is like when a volcano suddenly erupts and the landscape changes drastically in a short amount of time. And non-stressful or uniform change can be like a mountain slowly eroding over time, that the effect is total change, but over a long period.
So I was just thinking, listening to you about transits, and I was thinking of how quickly in the latter part of the 20th century, Pluto has been moving. It's obviously slowing down now, but I think then it means that there's a period of time in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st, where there were quite a lot of potentially challenging Pluto transits that an individual might encounter. I'm just wondering whether there's something about the quality of this time that is for for human beings, a time of cataclysmic change as a species together.
Right. The transits that you referenced, that's right, that there's a it is symbolizing cataclysmic evolution for the collective and for the species, due to, in my understanding, a buildup or a resistance to changes that were necessary for the survival of the whole, and it's reached a maximum point, or it's reached a critical mass. And as you were saying, that's reflected through the transits in terms of now producing cataclysmic evolution. We're going to have no choice but to change, in my view.
So now it's slowing down. Does that mean that it's a time to really start honing in on the progress that needs to be made?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. That progressively as well, different groups or different pockets of people are coming together to work for the good of the whole. And from my understanding, hunkering down, exactly, that it's from that natural principle, or it's for those people who are bonding together, especially as Pluto goes into Aquarius and Uranus continues to transit in Taurus, that the more that there can be momentum around new technologies that can be used for the survival of the whole. Different resources or green energy, how to really make that accessible to all, in terms of what we're seeing in dramatic climate change and so on, possibly possibly being able to minimize the chances of new diseases, or by cleaning up the energy, by cleaning up the atmosphere, by cleaning up the climate, and so on, different resources, or using our resources in a different way, that the good of the whole, are hunkering down and really making those changes from that baseline. Exactly, that it's the right time frame for that, and the strength of, from my understanding too, seeing people really bond together and share ideas that can be applied in exactly that way, can create an overall regeneration, or can help produce new technologies or new ways of using existing resources that can help offset, or can potentially help minimize the current collective trauma and crisis.
Just thinking too, as we're talking about the soul's need to return to source, perhaps that the biggest trauma that we have had as a species is the wrestling with what spirituality means. And particularly in the West, we have moved away from spirituality to the point where the materialist worldview is the worldview that's predominant. And I can't help feel that, as you were talking about Pluto going into Aquarius, but that's only one sign away from Pisces, and Neptune is in Pisces right now. So I'm wondering whether actually what's happening is a need to redress that balance, to bring back a sense of spirituality, because we've drifted too far from source. A bit like, with Mercury, when it goes retrograde, it's because it's moved too far from the sun and it needs to move back towards the sun. And it feels to me as though we've strayed so far from the source that actually what this is really about is the need to turn back towards the source. What do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. I can see that that shift that is being initiated through progressive liberation or deconditioning from the relationship to nature, which in my view reflects just what you're saying, that um, we're coming back to, or that we're rebalancing our relationship with nature to the whole, which reflects our collective journey back to source. Because we've come too far away from that natural balance, or we've come too far away from that natural relationship that we all share as a whole to nature. And coming back to that, or the natural principle that you were speaking of, it takes one extremity to counteract another extremity to come ultimately to come back into balance. So we're experiencing that. We're experiencing one extremity in order ultimately to rebalance.
Well, the aim of Pluto, of course, is always regeneration. And maybe then what we're talking about is a regeneration of our relationship with spirituality, with source. And that means then the relationship we have with ourselves as human beings, the understanding that that is something that is sacred, that it's not to be changed or meddled with by technology, that it's meant to be in some way honored, because that's what nature is, and to stop tampering and changing nature to suit us and work with it. And maybe that's part of the Uranus and Taurus as well. It's because Uranus always wants to bring in the change, and maybe that's the change to nature. And maybe it might be better to actually change our relationship with nature and actually respect it for what it is and work with it.
Oh, exactly. That it can bring us back to our natural relationship, as you were saying, to ourselves and to the source, which is being in balance and being co-equal, and being able to use or to respect nature as nature is, instead of trying to change it to suit our needs, just as you say.
Well, we started off with the soul. We brought it to the individual, and we've widened it to the collective and the return to source. So in our own way, in our little interview, we have just followed the path of evolutionary astrology. So I think this is a good point on which to end our little introduction into this incredibly beautiful and complex topic. So thank you so much, Deva, for speaking to us today.
Oh, it's been really nice to have this time and space, and thank you for your time.
The book we've been talking about is Evolutionary Astrology, Pluto and Your Karmic Mission by Deva Green, and I will put a link to this book on the notes accompanying the podcast. If people wanted to reach you, Deva, how could they do that?
Oh, thanks for asking. Feel free to contact me through email, Deva Green, DevaGreen @fastmail.fm.
Thank you so much once again. And thank you all for joining us and listening to this particular interview. Next week, I will be talking about Hellenistic astrology. Until then, goodbye. So I'm just going to stop recording now, if I can. Every time I try to press the button, it's ignoring me.